They thought silence would swallow her. They thought secret memos, whispered threats, and a campaign of shadows would be enough to bend her into submission. But on that rainy Thursday afternoon, in the heart of Washington, D.C., a single voice cut through the chamber with such clarity that even the walls seemed to tremble. That voice belonged to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. History has a strange rhythm. Sometimes it moves slowly, grinding like rusted gears in an old machine. But sometimes it leaps, jolting forward in a moment so sharp, so unflinching, that you feel it before you even understand it. Crockett's words that day were not long, not thunderous, but they were precise, like a blade sliding through the illusions of untouchable power. "Maybe they've confused the Constitution with a crown," she said, and the room shifted. "You see, this is not simply a story about politics. It is not just about hearings, or the tension between Congress and the courts. This is a story about what happens when a black woman stands upright in a place designed to silence her. It is about truth colliding with privilege, about courage daring to pierce the armor of institutions centuries old. It is about the storm that follows, when one voice, unafraid, says aloud what millions whisper behind closed doors. Let us pause here, because we must understand the weight of this moment. For generations, black voices in America were measured, muted, dismissed. From the auction blocks where our ancestors were stripped of dignity, to the courtrooms where justice was a costume worn by the powerful, the message was clear: be quiet, stay small, survive. Yet survival was never the end of our story. From Harriet Tubman to Martin Luther King Jr., from Rosa Parks to Shirley Chisholm, each generation has lifted the register, spoke louder, demanded more. Jasmine Crockett is not the first to do so, but in the halls of Congress today, she may be among the few who dare to remind the guardians of power that crowns do not belong in a democracy. The question, then, is not whether her words mattered. The question is what those words unleashed. For power does not take kindly to being questioned. It does not rest politely while its mask is peeled away. Power strikes back, sometimes openly, sometimes in shadows. And that is where our story begins, not just with a sentence spoken, but with the firestorm it ignited. This is a political thriller. Yes, but more than that, it is a story written in the long ink of black history of defiance, of survival, of truth, told at unbearable cost. It is about how one woman, armed only with a suit, a microphone, and a mind sharpened in the courts of justice, faced a machinery designed to crush dissent. And it is about what happened when she refused to flinch. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. It is the echo of their unfinished prayers, rising now in the voice of a daughter who will not be silenced. Stay, listen, and subscribe, because a black voice unmuted is not just one woman's defiance. It is our collective inheritance. It is our duty to carry it forward. Power in America has always been wrapped in ceremony, marble pillars, solemn oaths, robes of authority, all designed to project permanence, to suggest that what was built will endure untouched. For more than 2 centuries, the United States Supreme Court has stood as one of those monuments. 9 justices, robed in black, charged with guarding the Constitution. Their power is vast, their tenure lifelong, their names etched into the architecture of law itself. But permanence is often a mask, and every mask eventually cracks. To understand why the words of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett carried such weight, one must first understand the fortress she spoke against. The Supreme Court is not merely a legal body. It is, in practice, a temple of American authority. Its members, once confirmed, rarely face scrutiny again. They serve not for terms, but for lifetimes. And with each passing decade, the institution has built around itself a shield untouchable, unchallenged, unaccountable. Critics may debate politicians, may lampoon presidents, may unseat governors, but justices, they stand apart, almost monarchic in their distance. Among them is Clarence Thomas, appointed in the year 1991. He entered the court at one of the most divisive confirmation hearings in modern memory. The name Anita Hill remains etched into the story of his rise, a woman whose testimony of harassment was dismissed by many ridiculed by others, and yet believed by millions watching across the country. The Senate confirmed Thomas by the slimmest of margins, and in doing so, they reinforced a truth older than the Constitution itself. Power bends toward those it wishes to protect. From that moment forward, Thomas learned the art of silence. He spoke rarely during hearings, often going years without a single question. He built his armor not in words but in endurance, surviving scandals that might have broken another man. By the 2020s, he was the longest-serving justice still on the bench. He had outlasted critics, sidestepped ethics, complaints, and cultivated influence far beyond the courtroom. His wife, Virginia Thomas, became a political actor in her own right, her hands never far from the levers of conservative strategy. Together, they represented a fortress of their own, unyielding, fortified, and largely untouchable. And then came a woman named Jasmine Crockett. Born not into privilege but into grit, Crockett carved her path as a public defender in Dallas, Texas. She stood in cramped courtrooms where the ceilings leaked and the benches groaned with the weight of forgotten defendants. She fought for those without voices, endured the sneers of prosecutors, the impatience of judges, the disdain of those who believed justice was a privilege for the few. Her weapon was not wealth or favor, but language sharp, quick, relentless. She knew how to speak to a jury in plain terms, how to cut through legal jargon, how to defend truth when truth was all her clients had. Her career in politics was not inevitable. For years she considered herself simply a servant of the law, bound to defend those abandoned by the system. But injustice has a way of calling people higher. When she saw communities stripped of resources, families buried under the weight of discrimination, and a legal system too often blind to fairness, she stepped into politics not for ambition, but for necessity. Elected to Congress, she carried the same edge she had honed in courtrooms. She was not one for empty gestures. She was not one to flinch. So when the Judiciary Oversight hearing convened on judicial accountability, the room carried a tension unspoken. Representatives circled the subject like hawks, too cautious to strike. They hinted at scandals, danced around names, wrapped their concerns in layers of politeness. It was the old game. Say enough to be heard, but not enough to wound. But Crockett did not play that game. She leaned into the microphone. Her tone was steady, her words chosen with surgical precision. If certain justices believe they are above scrutiny, she said, then maybe they've confused the Constitution with a crown. The sentence cracked across the chamber, like lightning across a summer sky. It was subtle enough to escape censure, sharp enough to pierce the room. Staffers looked up. Members blinked in disbelief. And somewhere, perhaps far from that chamber, a man who had long considered himself untouchable felt a nerve twitch that he thought was buried. This moment did not rise from nowhere. It came from a lineage, from generations of black voices who stood in rooms never meant for them and declared truths the nation did not wish to hear. When Crockett spoke, she carried the echo of Fannie Lou Hamer, saying, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." She carried the fire of Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run for president, who once declared she was unbought and unbossed. She carried the steel of Harriet Tubman, who moved not with permission, but with conviction. In Crockett's words, history was not past, it was alive, standing in that chamber, confronting the crown of false authority. The gavel struck. The hearing moved on, but something had shifted. It was as though the chamber itself had inhaled sharply and forgotten how to exhale, because in that instant, the fragile line between deference and defiance had been crossed. Crockett had not merely criticized policy. She had questioned the throne. To question a throne in America is no small act. This is a nation that clings to the myth of checks and balances, while often hiding the truth that some institutions are rarely checked at all. The Supreme Court is not elected. Its justices cannot be recalled. They answer only to themselves. A closed circle of 9 deciding the fate of millions. And when one Congresswoman, in a 5-minute window, dared to suggest that crowns had no place in a republic, she cracked the illusion of permanence. It is important to remember the weight of that illusion. For centuries, Black Americans were told they were 3/5 of a person, written into the Constitution as fractions. They were told their voices did not matter. Their lives did not belong to them. to stand now, in the heart of Congress, and declare that no one is above scrutiny. That was not just political theatre, it was history speaking through a woman unafraid to bear the cost. Thus the story begins, not with an ordinary speech, but with a fracture between what America claims that no one is above the law, and what America protects that some are too powerful to challenge. Jasmine Crockett did not invent that fracture, but by speaking aloud, she made it visible, and once visible, it could no longer be ignored. That is the root of this story. Not just a clash between a congresswoman and a justice, not just another chapter in Washington's endless theater. It is the collision of two legacies, one of silence guarded by marble walls, the other of truth carried on the breath of those who refused to bow. And as the rain fell on that Thursday afternoon, the question hung heavier than the clouds above. What happens when the Constitution is mistaken for a crown, and a black woman dares to say so out loud? The aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's words did not come with thunder or applause. It came in whispers. In Washington, whispers are louder than any gavel. They slip through corridors, travel across dinner tables, and end up shaping the fate of those who dare to disturb the quiet. The very day she left the chamber, the whispers began. Clarence Thomas sat in his home in Fairfax County that night, the rain outside tapping against the windows like a metronome, keeping time with his thoughts. On the screen before him, the clip of Crockett's statement replayed on a loop. Her face, her voice, her calm defiance, all of it pressed against the armor he had built over decades. His wife, Virginia Thomas, paced near the kitchen, scrolling through reactions on her phone. She's trying to make a name off your back. Virginia muttered, her tone sharp with disdain. Thomas said nothing. He simply watched again. Virginia's voice cut the silence once more. She dangerous. You let this go unanswered. Others will follow. That night, Thomas made calls. Not the kind that leave records. Not the kind preserved in emails. These were calls in the language of Washington, vague but pointed, casual but freighted with intent. A word here, a suggestion there, and suddenly a chain of motion is set into play. It was not about the law. It was about reminding everyone where the lines were drawn. Meanwhile, Jasmine was back in Dallas for the weekend. Her mother's house, a refuge from the noise of Capitol Hill. She tried to rest, to breathe in the smell of cornbread rising in the oven, to anchor herself in something familiar. But rest does not come easily when the ground itself has shifted. By Saturday morning, her phone buzzed incessantly. Her team forwarded her a document, a leaked memo from a federal agency's internal board. It spoke of a possible review of conduct for Crockett, citing inflammatory statements that may warrant ethical scrutiny. Jasmine stared at it in silence. Not shocked she had been a lawyer long enough to recognize a setup when she saw one, but unsettled by its timing. Leona Barrow, her chief of staff, joined her on a late-night video call. This isn't coincidence, Leona said, her brow furrowed as she scanned the memo. Somebody high up wants to put you in a corner, but they're hiding behind procedure. Jasmine leaned back, exhaled slowly. They won't say what rule I broke. They just want noise. They want me to panic, to stumble, to explain myself. Leona's voice was steady but worried. You're not going to, are you? Jasmine looked straight at the screen. No, I'm going to prepare. By Monday, the tide was turning. Her name began to trend, not in celebration, but in accusation. Headlines on cable news channels read, unprofessional conduct, disrespectful toward judiciary, unfit for office. The wording was too coordinated, too precise to be random. Crockett recognized it instantly, the machinery of narrative at work. She had seen it in courtrooms. When prosecutors twisted a phrase or misrepresented a client's history, you do not need facts to cage someone, you need perception. And perception was being sharpened into a weapon against her. What unnerved her most was not the attack, but the silence that followed. Colleagues who once praised her as a rising star now avoided her calls. The Progressive Caucus group chat, usually alive with chatter, went quiet. Even media outlets that had once highlighted her grit began to hedge, shifting their tone from admiration to neutrality. Jasmine knew this tactic well. Isolation. You do not crush a person outright. You make them doubt their footing by stripping away their allies. The silence was as loud as the accusations. Then came the letter. It arrived on Tuesday morning, bearing the Department of Justice seal, though unsigned. Its language was vague, referencing a pending inquiry into potential violations of ethical standards and decorum expected of federal representatives. No specifics, not charges, just enough heat to set the air on fire. Leona read it twice before speaking. They're fishing. Jasmine nodded. But they've already leaked it. It's not about facts, it's about narrative. Across town, in the polished suite of the Hay Adams Hotel, Clarence Thomas sat with an old friend, retired Judge Richard Baines. Baines lowered his voice as a waiter poured coffee. You think this will make her back off? Thomas stirred his cup once. Deliberately. She's a threat to the institution. Baines raised an eyebrow. You mean to you? Thomas shot him a look. But Baines continued. Look, Clarence, I'm not defending her. But when you start using backdoor pressure on members of Congress, alarms go off. Just make sure you're not building a fire you can't put out. Back in Dallas, Jasmine's nights grew restless. It was not fear that kept her awake, but the sense of invisible motion. Things were shifting behind closed doors. While she stood in the open, it reminded her of her days as a public defender, when judges whispered with prosecutors outside her earshot, when decisions were made before she entered the room. She had survived that world, and she would survive this. But this time the stakes were higher. This was not about one case or one client. This was about the right of an elected representative to speak truth without being drowned in retaliation. By midweek, the preliminary inquiry was confirmed. A federal ethics committee requested her written response by Friday. Jasmine refused. Instead, she set up her camera in her home office and recorded a statement for the people. Her eyes were steady, her tone calm but unyielding. I will not be bullied into silence. If holding people accountable for hiding behind power is considered misconduct, then we have bigger problems than just me. The video was posted online, and within 24 hours, it reached over 2 million views. Supporters hailed her courage. Critics doubled down. But what mattered most was this. Jasmine had chosen her battleground. She would not fight in whispered memos or unsigned letters. She would fight in the open. Before the people, the journey had only begun. The threats were sharpening, the silence of allies deepening, and the machinery of narrative grinding forward. But Crockett had made her choice. She would not retreat. And as she prepared for the storm ahead, one truth rang clear. In a world where silence was weaponized, her refusal to flinch was itself a revolution. By the time the sun rose over Washington on Tuesday, the air was already thick with narrative. Cable news channels rolled out their banners. Each headline sharpened like a blade aimed at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Unprofessional conduct. Read one chyron. Disrespectful toward judiciary. Flashed another. On opinion pages, writers who had once praised her grit now shifted their tone, couching admiration with doubt. Promising, but reckless, wrote one columnist. She speaks with fire, but is fire what we need? The coordination was too precise to ignore. Phrases echoed across outlets as though drafted from a single template. It was the Washington playbook at work. Bury your opponent, not with evidence, but with repetition. Repeat a phrase often enough, and the public will take it as truth. It was a tactic as old as politics itself, but this time the target was a black woman who refused to bow. Jasmine knew the game. As a public defender, she had seen prosecutors twist stories, magnify flaws, and drown defendants under the weight of accusation. In court, she had fought those tactics one by one, but now the scale was different. This was not one man's trial. This was her own reputation, tried in the court of public opinion. What unsettled her most was not the attack, but the silence that followed. Colleagues who had once crowded her office with praise now avoided her calls. The Progressive Caucus group chat, usually buzzing with late-night strategy and solidarity, went eerily quiet. When she reached out to Representative Felix Ardmore, a man who had once called her the future of the party, his staff politely said he was unavailable. Unavailable, the most Washington word of all. Isolation was the oldest weapon in politics. You do not need to destroy a person outright. You only need to convince them they stand alone, make them doubt their allies, doubt their footing, doubt themselves. Jasmine recognized the move. She had studied it in law school, seen it in history books, lived it in courtrooms. But recognizing a trap does not make it any easier to escape. Then came the letter. It arrived in her office in Washington, embossed with the seal of the Department of Justice, though unsigned. Its language was deliberately vague. A pending inquiry into potential violations of ethical standards and decorum expected of federal representatives. No specific accusation. No clear charge. Just enough smoke to make people wonder if there was fire. Leona Barrow, her chief of staff, read it twice before speaking. They're fishing. Jasmine nodded. They're not after facts. They're after narrative. And now they've leaked this to 3 outlets before we even saw it. Leona sighed, the frustration in her voice plain. They want you on the defensive. They want you to explain yourself while they hold the megaphone. Across town, in a quiet corner of the Hay Adams Hotel, Clarence Thomas met with retired Judge Richard Baines. The 2 men had known each other for decades, their friendship built in the years when both wore the robes of law. Now, the stakes were heavier. You think this will make her back off? Baines asked, lowering his voice as a waiter refilled their coffee. Thomas stirred his cup slowly, his face unreadable. She's a threat to the institution. Baines raised an eyebrow. You mean to you? Thomas shot him a look sharp enough to silence another man. But Baines continued. Look, Clarence, I'm not defending her. But when you start leaning on backdoor pressure to muzzle a member of Congress, alarms go off. Be careful. You might be building a fire you can't put out. Thomas said nothing. But silence, too, is a kind of answer. Meanwhile, Jasmine's days blurred into a cycle of interviews declined. Calls unanswered, and headlines that grew more pointed with each passing hour. At first, she tried to shake it off, reminding herself of harsher days in courtrooms where judges rolled their eyes or prosecutors tried to trip her with tricks. But this felt different. This was not one case. This was the system itself coordinated, relentless, faceless. At night, she sat with Leona and her small team in rented office space, mapping out the onslaught. Every cancelled meeting, every vague excuse, every email that mysteriously vanished from shared folders each was a thread. Together, they began to weave those threads into a pattern. The picture that emerged was chilling. This was not a spontaneous backlash. This was orchestration. Leona tapped her pen against the table, her voice low but firm. They don't want accountability. They want containment. You're not being investigated because you broke rules. You're being investigated because you broke silence. Jasmine leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then we know what we're up against. Not truth. Not justice. Narrative. The storm outside grew louder. But inside, Jasmine's resolve hardened. She had lived through too many nights where the world insisted she stay quiet. This time she would not. If they thought headlines and whispers could bury her, they had forgotten the weight of history standing behind her. For when one black woman dares to speak, she does not speak alone. She speaks with the voices of those who came before, and with the echoes of those yet to rise. And so the battle lines were drawn not in marble courts or gilded chambers, but in the invisible war of stories. The question was no longer whether she had spoken too boldly. The question was whether the machinery of silence could outpace the fire of truth. If you believe this is what justice should have always sounded like, say truth in the comments below. The storm did not arrive with sirens or warnings. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling over the city at dawn. By the time Jasmine Crockett recognized its weight, it was already around her, pressing close, invisible but undeniable. It began with a vehicle, a black SUV that appeared outside her Dallas home. It sat there for hours, engine humming, windows tinted so dark that even the sunlight could not pierce them. The next day, it returned. Different plates, the same silent presence. The police wrote it off as coincidence, but Jasmine knew the truth. Coincidence does not repeat itself with such precision. Inside her home, the mood was no lighter. Her mother, usually animated, stopped turning on the news. Every headline seemed another strike, another echo of words twisted against her. Her 14-year-old niece, wide-eyed, with the fear of childhood meeting adulthood too early, asked the question no child should ask. Auntie, are they going to arrest you? Jasmine felt the question cut deeper than any headline. She knelt on the kitchen floor, looked into her niece's eyes, and said with quiet steadiness, I did nothing wrong. I told the truth. Sometimes that makes powerful people nervous, But nervous is not the same as right. The girl nodded, but her gaze lingered, searching for reassurance. Jasmine could not fully give. The storm grew wider. Leona Barrow, her chief of staff, began charting the anomalies. 3 congressional aides cancelled meetings within 48 hours, each citing vague excuses. 2 of Jasmine's bills, once gliding through committee with ease, suddenly stalled. Emails vanished from shared folders. Calendar entries shifted or deleted. What seemed like isolated glitches sharpened into a pattern. Sabotage does not always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it comes disguised as administrative error. Then came the call that rattled even the hardest of her team. During a late-night strategy meeting, in a cramped office smelling of burnt coffee and paper, Timothy Voss stood pale and trembling. "I just got this," he whispered, holding up his phone. No caller ID. Just a voicemail. He pressed play. A distorted voice, mechanical and hollow, filled the room. "You keep helping her. You're going to be collateral." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. For 30 long seconds, silence swallowed the room. Finally, Jasmine reached for the phone, pressed replay, and listened twice more. Her expression did not shift. She handed the device back to Timothy and said evenly, "They're not used to women like me. They don't know what to do when we don't flinch." The staff drew strength from her calm. But later that night, alone, Jasmine finally let her guard slip. She stared at the ceiling in darkness, her body heavy with exhaustion, and wondered not if the threats were real, but how far they were willing to go. By dawn, she had made her decision. Running was never an option. She booked the earliest flight back to Washington, unannounced. The battle was not in Dallas. It was in the Capitol, where shadows stretched across marble walls and whispers shaped policy. She met Leona in a quiet corner of the Thurgood Marshall building, the table between them filled with files, notes, and fragments of rumor pieced together like a puzzle. One name surfaced again and again, stitched through the web like dark thread. Dominic Ryland, once a legal advisor, long known as a fixer. He was the kind of man who left no trace, but left every mark. In the 1990s, he worked for Clarence Thomas. Now he advised judicial ethics groups, the very ones fanning the flames against her. "We need more than whispers," Jasmine said, her voice low but firm. Leona leaned closer, eyes sharp. "We have someone, a clerk, young, nervous, but willing to talk off record." Jasmine exhaled slowly. "Then we talk." 2 nights later, in a dimly lit Baltimore hotel bar. The meeting took place. The woman was barely 30, her hands trembling as she clutched a glass of water. She refused to give her name. "I cannot prove everything," she whispered, her voice cracking, "but I have seen the emails. Ryland is coordinating with outside groups. They are monitoring certain members of Congress, mostly women, mostly black." Jasmine's face did not change. "And why tell me this?" she asked. The woman's eyes filled with something between fear and conviction. "Because I thought the courts were sacred, and now I don't know what to believe." From her small bag, she slid a flash drive across the table. "I copied what I could. If anyone finds out, it will ruin me." Her hand trembled as it released the drive. Jasmine placed her palm over it. "Steady, firm. They will not. You are safe." But both women knew that safety was only a word. It had no guarantee. That night, back in her Washington apartment, Jasmine sat before a burner laptop. Leona hovered behind her, arms folded tight, as folder after folder opened. Screenshots, chat logs, strateg memos. Her name appeared in 3 of them, bold as if written in fire. One subject line froze the room. "Containment plan." "Crockett," Leona whispered. "They planned this before the hearing. They were waiting." Jasmine clenched her jaw. "They were not offended by what I said. They were prepared for me to say it." The truth unfolded line by line. Memos detailing narrative manipulation, drafts of media strategies, keywords flagged from her speeches. It was not coincidence. It was blueprint. A blueprint to isolate, intimidate, and eventually silence her. For a long moment, Jasmine sat motionless, staring at the screen. The room was quiet except for the hum of the laptop fan. At last she whispered, "This is not just about me." Leona's voice was low, but fierce. "No, This is about power deciding who gets to speak. The weight of the discovery pressed down heavy, but in that weight was clarity. She was not imagining enemies behind shadows. They were real, documented, strategizing, and in her hands lay proof. Not suspicion, not rumor, proof. The question now was timing. If she revealed it too early, they would deny, spin, and bury her in counter-narratives. If she waited too long, the machine would consume her before the truth could reach daylight. Both choices carried risk. Both required courage. As she closed the laptop, exhaustion in her bones, she whispered the truth aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. Power, when cornered, does not retreat. It strikes back, and the next strike is already coming. The truth, once released, is impossible to contain. It spreads like fire, feeding on oxygen, leaping from corner to corner, until even those who try to look away are forced to see the flames. That was the scene when Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the small stage at the National Press Club, her navy blazer plain, her voice steady, and the folder in her hands heavy with proof. In that hour, the chamber shifted, and by the next sunrise, the nation shifted with it. The first headlines broke before noon. Congresswoman alleges secret plot to silence her. Within hours, news tickers ran constant loops of her words, her documents, her unwavering stare into the cameras. Some anchors called it bold, others labeled it reckless, but none could deny the power of what she presented. Emails, memos, strategy drafts, her name etched again and again under the title Containment Plan. Cable networks replayed the clip every 30 minutes. On social media, her statement was clipped, subtitled, remixed. One line in particular took root. If silence is a weapon, then fear is its ammunition. But neither will silence me. By evening, it was hashtagged on millions of posts, carried across timelines like a rallying cry. But as the truth traveled, so did the backlash. Anonymous callers flooded her office, their voices dripping with veiled threats. One email reads simply, "You've woken something you cannot put back to sleep." Her staff grew tense. Timothy stopped riding the metro after noticing the same stranger shadowing him 3 days in a row. Leona switched to burner phones, convinced their lines were compromised. Yet, alongside the threats came an avalanche of support. Law students sent handwritten letters, calling her courage the spark we needed. Former judges, some long retired, others still influential in legal circles, wrote op-eds demanding accountability in the courts. Even conservative-leaning newspapers, usually hostile to her politics, carried uneasy editorials acknowledging that serious questions must now be asked. In Dallas, her mother answered the door to neighbors bearing food and quiet words of encouragement. In Washington, her inbox filled with unexpected allies. Congressman William Delaney, a centrist who had once dismissed her as too combative, sent a short text. "If you need support, I'm in." Others followed. Not all public, not all loud, but enough to signal a shift. Meanwhile, Clarence Thomas sat in silence. In his chambers, the television flickered with Jasmine's image. Repeating on loop, he stood rigid, arms folded, his phone buzzing unanswered on the desk. His wife, Virginia, broke the quiet. "They're turning on you." Thomas did not blink. "They're just confused." "Then unconfuse them," she snapped. But Thomas knew better. Storms you can outlast. Proof you cannot. Behind closed doors. Republican aides whispered of damage. "You cannot coordinate surveillance on a lawmaker and expect it not to explode," one muttered. But their dilemma was plain. Defend the justice and risk their credibility, or remain silent and risk his wrath. Many chose silence. Silence, however, was already breaking. 10 days after Jasmine's press conference, a leak from inside the administrative office of the U.S. courts made headlines. Partial transcripts of closed-door meetings surfaced. One line sent shockwaves through every newsroom. If Crockett continues on this path, she becomes a threat to judicial integrity. Long-term strategy may require legal obstruction. The phrase legal obstruction landed like a hammer. It was not just gossip now. It was intent. Recorded. Undeniable. Protests erupted outside the Supreme Court building. Crowds carried signs reading "No crown above the Constitution" and "Who judges the judges." For the first time in decades, the court itself felt pressure, not from academics or politicians, but from ordinary citizens demanding transparency. For Jasmine, the days blurred into a haze of interviews, security briefings, and sleepless nights. Her team rotated shifts, sleeping on office couches. She moved between hearings and panels with a calm surface, though exhaustion carved lines beneath her eyes. In private, she admitted to Leona, "This isn't victory, it's survival." Yet survival itself became a statement. Every time she walked onto a stage, every time she answered a question without flinching, she reminded people that fear could not cage her. At a women's advocacy event in Bethesda, she stood before 300 and declared, "If holding power accountable is misconduct, then the word justice has lost its meaning." The crowd rose to their feet. Her influence spread beyond politics. Law schools held panels dissecting her case. Churches prayed for her protection. Community organizers rallied around her name, using it as a banner for broader fights against corruption and abuse of power. Her struggle was no longer hers alone. It had become a symbol, a mirror reflecting the fragility of democracy itself. But symbols carry weight, and weight leaves scars. One evening, Jasmine returned to her apartment to find a package on the doorstep. Inside was nothing but photographs, candid shots of her speaking at rallies, walking into hearings, even shopping with her niece. No explanation. Just time-stamped proof that someone had been watching, closely, intimately. Leona wanted to call the FBI immediately. Jasmine, staring at the photos, whispered, "Let them watch. If they think silence will protect them, they're wrong." Still, the pressure took its toll. Her niece stopped calling. Frightened by headlines, she did not understand. Her mother avoided television altogether. At night, Jasmine lay awake, the ceiling above her, spinning with questions. How far would they go? And was she ready for the cost of knowing? Then came the crack that shifted the ground again. A major newspaper published leaked audio. The voice of Dominic Ryland, grainy but recognizable, speaking in a private strategy session. "She's one of the loud ones. If we can't box her in legally, we isolate her, make her a risk." The audio did what documents could not. It carried tone, intent, emotion. The country heard not just words, but malice. That evening, Jasmine sat with Leona in their makeshift war room, the air thick with tension. "We won't get a cleaner shot than this," Leona said. "People are listening now." Jasmine nodded slowly. "Then we need someone from the inside. A voice, not just paper." She pulled out a folded piece of paper she already called. "She's ready." The name was Kayla Dewitt, a former assistant counsel for a federal oversight board. Quiet, cautious, not a figure anyone would expect. But when she sat beside Jasmine at a Senate subcommittee hearing, raised her hand, and swore her oath, silence fell. Her testimony was clear: weekly briefings, coordinated strategies, deliberate retaliation against Jasmine Crockett. The words landed like thunder. By the following morning, Clarence Thomas released a statement, 3 paragraphs, vague denials, accusations of politicization. It fell flat. Editorial boards called it hollow. Legal scholars called it evasive. On the steps of the Supreme Court, protesters chanted louder. No one above the bench. For Jasmine, the impact was clear. The story was no longer about one congresswoman. It was about the survival of accountability itself. And in that survival, she discovered something deeper. Her voice was not just hers anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever been told to stay quiet. Every person who had ever been made to doubt the value of their truth. The storm did not end with headlines. Headlines are brief things, loud for a week, sometimes 2, before the world's attention drifts elsewhere. But legacies are not measured in weeks. They are measured in echoes in the quiet places where people whisper your name, in the classrooms where your struggle becomes a case study, in the homes where your courage becomes an example to children still learning what truth costs. For Jasmine Crockett, the weeks after Kayla Dewitt's testimony brought a strange, quiet. It was not peace, not yet, but it was a pause. Clarence Thomas had retreated into written denials and silence. The weight of his authority dented, but not destroyed. Dominic Ryland had vanished from public view, his firm dismantled piece by piece until he was little more than a rumor on a property near Flagstaff. The chatter of cable news turned to fresher scandals, and yet, something lingered. Not absence, but shadow. In Washington, Jasmine returned to her seat at the committee table. Her voice did not falter. Her questions cut with the same sharpness, but colleagues looked at her differently now. Some with admiration, some with caution, some with the calculation of politicians sensing which way the wind might blow. But the respect, even among critics, was undeniable. She was no longer the rookie firebrand. She was the woman who had faced down the silence of power and survived in Dallas, her mother's kitchen filled with neighbors again. This time they did not come with whispered concerns, but with pride. Her Nisa, still carrying the weight of fear, asked fewer questions now. Instead, she watched her aunt closely, as though memorizing the posture of someone who did not bow. One afternoon, while helping set the table, the girl asked softly, "How did you not fall apart?" Jasmine smiled, pulled her chair close, and answered, without rush, "I did, just not where anyone could see it. The trick isn't pretending you are unbreakable. The trick is getting back up after you crack, and remembering why you stood up in the first place." The girl nodded slowly. In her young eyes was something brighter than relief. It was understanding. Beyond her home, the ripple widened. Law students cited her case in essays about transparency and judicial ethics. Professors assigned her hearings as required viewing. Church leaders preached her words as modern psalms of courage. Activists in small towns used her name as a banner when confronting local corruption. Her fight, though born in the marble halls of Washington, had traveled further into classrooms, pulpits, and community centers, where people discovered in her defiance a mirror for their own struggles. Yet Jasmine did not celebrate. She did not take victory laps, did not hold parties. When asked by a reporter what lesson she had learned, she answered plainly that even the highest walls can crack if enough people push at once. It was not a boast, but a reminder. Her words carried less triumph than warning. In the months that followed, 3 bills, she authored, on judicial transparency advanced further than expected. One passed the House, surprising, even allies who thought it symbolic. Another gained bipartisan support, not out of affection for her, but out of fear that opposing it would signal complicity. For Jasmine, each step was a sign that persistence mattered. She often told Leona, "They think exposure is the end, but exposure is just the beginning. The real fight is what comes after." Meanwhile, whispers about Clarence. Thomas grew quieter in the press but louder in private. Insiders spoke of legacy, of succession, of whether a resignation would arrive quietly before the weight of scandal grew heavier. Nothing was confirmed. But trust, once cracked, never seals whole again, and that crack was hers. Not to own, not to claim, but to know she had forced it into the open. One spring afternoon, Jasmine visited Southern University in Baton Rouge. The auditorium swelled with young faces, eager, buzzing with anticipation. Among them sat Amani Jacobs, 19 years old, sharp-eyed, studying pre-law. She had followed every twist of Jasmine's story, clipping articles, saving tweets, replaying speeches, like lessons. When the event ended, she waited in the hallway with dozens of others. Jasmine, tired, yet unhurried, moved through the line, one by one. When she reached Amani, the young woman did not ask for a photograph. Instead, she asked, "How do you keep going when they try everything to stop you?" Jasmine paused, looked her in the eye, and said softly, "You remember that the rules were not written to protect you, but you learn them anyway, and then you decide how to use them. That choice, that's power." Amani left the hallway not with a picture, but with a map. For her, and for countless others, Jasmine had become more than a headline. She was a compass. Back in Washington, the noise faded. Reporters moved on. Congress returned to its ordinary chaos. But Jasmine understood the silence differently now. It was not safety. It was waiting for the next battle, the next shadow, the next moment when her voice would once again be the unwelcome thunder in a room built for whispers. And she was ready. Because her story was never about one justice, one scandal, or even one congresswoman. It was about who gets to speak truth without punishment. It was about reminding a country that democracy does not collapse in explosions, it erodes in silences. And silence had been her enemy from the beginning. So when she spoke at a community event in Oak Cliff months later, wearing nothing but jeans and a white t-shirt, she ended her remarks with a sentence that captured her journey. I did not want to fight. But when people come for your voice, you do not whisper, you speak louder. And if they cannot stand the sound, they can step aside. The crowd erupted, but Jasmine did not smile. She simply stepped down from the stage, blending into the people she fought for, her words already leaving the room to live in echoes elsewhere. The story of Jasmine Crockett did not end with her press conference, or with leaked audio, or with Kayla Jewett's testimony. It did not end with bills passed or protests outside marble walls. It kept living in students who chose law because of her, in activists who refused silence because of her, in the everyday people who learned that questioning power is not treason, but duty. Legacies are not written in stone. They are written in voices. And Jasmine Crockett's voice had become a legacy not because it was the loudest, but because it refused to be silenced. Silence is often the system's sharpest weapon. It does not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with pressure, the kind that pushes people into corners until they believe staying quiet is survival. For decades, that silence has protected power, shielded privilege, and buried inconvenient truths beneath a cloak of respectability. But every weapon has its weakness, and Jasmine Crockett proved that silence shatters when confronted by a voice that refuses to bend. Her journey was not about one comment in a hearing, nor one scandal involving a justice. It was about a pattern, a culture of intimidation designed to make elected officials, especially women, especially black women, second-guess their right to speak truth. She exposed not only backroom deals and secret memos, but also the unspoken rules of a system that expects deference from those who were never meant to sit at the table. Her defiance revealed something deeper, that accountability is not optional in a democracy, and that fear is no substitute for legitimacy. For the elders who marched in the 60s, who remember fire hoses and police dogs, who carry the scars of a struggle that demanded courage just to vote, Jasmine's stand felt familiar. It echoed the spirit of those who refused to move to the back of the bus, who refused to stay quiet in the face of injustice. She was not on a bridge in Selma or in a jail in Birmingham, but the battlefield was the same. It was the fight against silence, the demand to be heard, the insistence that truth belongs not to the powerful, but to the people. For the younger generation, the Amanis sitting in classrooms, studying law, wondering if their voices will ever matter. Jasmine offered a map. She showed that cracks in marble walls are not accidents. They are made by pressure, persistence, and courage. She showed that fear is not proof of weakness, but evidence of impact. And most of all, she showed that survival is not enough. What matters is transforming survival into testimony, testimony into movement, and movement into legacy. Clarence Thomas's silence in the end was telling. His denials rang hollow not because of what he said, but because of what the country had already seen. Documents, emails, testimony, audio. Proof does not vanish with words. And though his career may not have ended in disgrace that year, the stain of exposure clung to him. History, after all, measures not the denials of the powerful, but the persistence of those who dared to challenge them. Jasmine Crockett walked through that fire and came out marked, yes, but unbroken. Her scars became symbols. Her sleepless nights became lessons. And her voice, once dismissed as too sharp, too bold, became a chorus, carried by thousands who whispered her name in rooms she never entered. That is legacy. Not applause, not trophies, but echoes that continue when the cameras have turned away. And so, for everyone listening, the message is simple. Your voice matters. Whether you are standing in a courtroom, teaching in a classroom, or speaking at a kitchen table, silence serves only those who fear the truth. The system depends on your hesitation. It depends on you doubting yourself. It depends on you staying quiet. But the moment you speak, the moment you claim your right to truth, the silence cracks. Remember Jasmine Crockett. Remember that she did not win every battle. She did not dismantle the court or erase corruption overnight. But she shifted the ground. She made silence expensive. And she reminded us all that power is not invincible. It is sustained only by the obedience of those it seeks to suppress. If you take nothing else from her story, take this. The loudest sound in a democracy is not the gavel striking wood or the chants of protest in the streets. It is the single voice that refuses to be silenced. The voice that says, "I will not whisper." The voice that speaks, even when the cost is heavy. That voice changes rooms, changes laws, changes generations. So let us not waste the gift of our voices. Use them, protect them, pass them on. And when the world tries to push you into a corner, remember Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman who stood her ground and made the corner too loud to ignore.